Hi guys, it's Ness, and in this episode of Ready Made Movie Review, we're going to be reviewing the Shudder exclusive Z. Yep, just the letter Z. The movie is attempting to make an original take on a very unoriginal concept. Lonely, only child has an imaginary friend. Turns out he's really not so imaginary and, in fact, very real and sinister in nature. We meet our three main characters: Beth, the mother; Kevin, the father, who has about 3 minutes of screen time in this entire movie; and Joshua, or Josh, who is the son who has the evil imaginary friend. Anyway, we get a ton of useless shots of their extremely over the top rich white people house, and then we go on to Josh's school, where it needs to be more and more highlighted that he's a lonely, isolated kid, I guess. Which brings us drastically to our next scene, where out of nowhere we find out that Beth's mother is dying. Yeah, this random plot is very random and just introduced and not really essential to the movie whatsoever. We cut back and suddenly it's the evening meal where they're eating the most cold plastic pizza I've ever seen in cinema. They ask suddenly what his imaginary best friend's name is, and to which he replies Z, and that's really all that comes from that, which, when later we find out some other things, is kind of weird that nothing is said about it. The next day, we get the dumbest scene where Beth is convinced she sees spooky eyes looking at her in the closet, when really it's just a train. But she switches on the light switch about 57 times to then come to the conclusion that it's just a toy train and moves on. That evening, we find out that Josh has been having trouble in school, and the dad, who we really never see, I guess, knew about it and kept it from his wife for reasons. I also don't really understand the timeline when we come in here. It kind of seems like just yesterday they asked the best friend's name, the imaginary friend's name, which is Z, and we're hearing now that Josh has been having trouble in school for months and blaming on his imaginary friend. Did they just ask about the imaginary friend yesterday and this has really been going on for months? Or is the timeline just bad and not really well organized? I'm probably going to go with the second one. I don't even know why I'm thinking about this so much. So, after they hear about this, they do what any smart parent would do and they take Josh to a child psychiatrist. And at the end, Josh calls to his imaginary friend Z. The doctor seems to recognize the name, and in that moment, you go, is there something more going on here? Perhaps the doctor is in cahoots with the demon. We have a new storyline opening up. That sounds pretty cool. Well, just like everything else, you'll probably be bitterly disappointed. They decide the best way to discipline their child for behaving and getting suspended from school is to take him to like a Freddy Fazbear's or whatever and show him a good time. And there, as the mom is messing around, I guess she sees Z for the first time, who's a very creepy humanoid looking thing. She, of course, gets terrified and goes to find her son, who obviously seems unfazed considering that's his imaginary friend. She later tells her husband Kevin, who basically does what he does best in this movie, and he really doesn't exist or respond to the situation in the slightest. The next day, we find out that the mother that we had completely forgotten about from the beginning of the movie that was dying is now dead. You didn't really have any interaction to this character. You didn't really get introduced to her. She really didn't even have a line. So I guess that's it, scene? What I find strange is that her death isn't really mentioned at all the rest of the movie. I mean, it happened, it was there, but there's really no grief. There's no funeral. There's not so much as, a family gathering to simply talk about her. Kind of seems like it was just a plot that was put in there. Why didn't we start the movie with the mother already dead if her death wasn't going to be essential to the plot of the movie? But right here, we also meet her sister Jenna for the first time, 30 minutes into the movie, who kind of seems like an alcoholic and barely really says anything coherent. I don't really think that that's the alcohol. It's probably just the awful script. Beth finds a creepy old alphabet toy in the basement after it was making noise, almost calling to her. We don't see her take it home with her or even discuss it with her sister, but it'll become important later. I guess child's toys are, creepy, you know? We randomly jump to a montage of scenes where Beth is attempting to get Josh a play date with friends from his school, and they're all ignoring her calls. This is kind of a really unnecessary scene that was thrown in there. I understand that they're trying to make it seem like that Josh is really turning into a bad kid, but this whole next 20-minute scene is kind of fluff. I am also, I don't really understand why the parents are ignoring her calls. Did they hear that Josh was possessed or something? I mean, we're aware that he was misbehaving in school, but it's never clear that he became vicious or acted out towards his peers. So, where's this isolation coming from? And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Someone finally picks up her calls, but seems very apprehensive to allow their kids to play together. And rightfully so, because after being in a house for about 30 seconds and without any conversation, talking, yelling, or warning, Josh apparently pushes the other child they're visiting down what is a massive staircase. I mean, really, whose stairs are built like that? And I'm also supposed to believe that an 8-year-old pushed another 8-year-old over that railing that they can barely see over. If it was Z, I would believe it, but in this movie, it's clearly hinting that Z is making Josh act out towards him. Z isn't really doing the actions. Josh wants to do the actions for Z to impress his newfound best friend. So I'm supposed to believe that an 8-year-old tossed another 8-year-old over a railing without any struggling sounds or warning whatsoever. That's a little weird. Hulk child, apparently. The next 25 minutes are basically the mom and dad arguing and the mother making drugged sandwiches to give her apparently mentally disturbed son. And we now get our glimpse that wasn't just 5 seconds in a creepy playground of what Z may look like. And apparently Josh has drawn him on the wall. I mean, how did an 8-year-old draw that? I mean, did he use paint? Is it pencil? Is it charcoal? Did Z draw that self-portrait himself? I don't really quite understand where this very detailed portrait of this really creepy demon is supposed to come from. I mean, it is creepy nonetheless. I won't deny it gave me a small shiver down my spine when I saw it for the first time, but it's kind of unnecessary, and they probably could have just gave us more screen time with the monster than show us this creepy painting of what he's supposed to look like that really didn't make any sense to where the plot was going. And the next day, Beth and Jenna are cleaning up their dead mother's house after there wasn't a funeral or any plans being made. For all I know, they left her up in her room, dead, rotting. We really don't see that room again, so little sus. They find some old movies, I guess, and she notices that Josh is now missing. She finds him in what looks like an office, staring at the ceiling fan. She seems very alarmed by this and tells him to never come in this room again, but never really gives a reason why. Later, Beth reveals she is the only person left in the world with a VCR, and she's watching old home movies she found. This is where she finds out she, in the home movies, has been talking to an imaginary friend named Z. Okay, we're stopping here, and this is where I'm calling BS. You mean to tell me that if you were a child, I remember things from when I was 8 to 10. You're telling me that when you were a child, you don't remember having a best friend named Z who was imaginary and maybe kind of looked like a demon? And maybe made you want to do bad things and say bad things. And now your very own son, who is that same age, has now been talking about an imaginary friend named Z. And this is something that, you don't think is relevant. The next morning, Josh gets very sick, and Beth believes that it's because of all the meds she's been giving him. She calls the doctor, and the dad is absolutely infuriated that she's medicated their son without telling him. But I mean, really, we see that this family seems to keep a lot of things from each other, as he kept Josh's behavior away from her in the beginning, and this seems to be more of a telltale of their terrible marriage than anything else. That night, she's pretty much drawn to the same creepy alphabet board that we never saw her take home with her. It's saying Z repeatedly, and then at some point it says her name, which is actually a little bit of creep, and I actually really liked that moment, but then it kind of ruins it with spelling out its full name, I guess. She writes down the letters and puts them together and just says them out loud like it's supposed to mean anything to us. So next, we get this extremely essential bathtub seance scene where apparently she just knows that if she says this demon's name multiple times, he'll just show up, I guess. And he shows up, obviously, and he looks a little ridiculous. She tells her husband how Z was her friend too, and that her son is not lying, which kind of makes her sound like a complete mental case, and maybe she's the one he should be medicating. She decides after all of that, she's going to call the child psychiatrist from the beginning of the movie who worked on her son. The psychiatrist then reveals that he remembers her as a child and treated her as a child for behavioral problems just like her son, associated to her imaginary friend named Z. Maybe the doctor might have thought to mention this the first time he saw you, or the first time he heard her son mention Z. You know, the psychiatrist hasn't really helped. The psychiatrist then goes on to make this very, very interesting game theory that the demon is using her son to speak to her and actually just wants her. Where this psychiatrist is getting this expertise in demons, I don't know. She then tries to rush home because she feels like suddenly this overwhelming urge that the demon is going to murder her entire family. The demon had every opportunity this entire movie to murder her family while they slept in their beds, but apparently she is right, because as she rushes home, she finds her house on fire and her beloved husband dead. Pretty much, he locks Josh in the room, and she has to tell the demon that she'll pretty much be with him to let Josh go. This demon is kind of a little clingy. I won't deny that. We then, after this dramatic scene, we cut to her dumping her son at her sister's house, who we still really don't know anything about, and she still has soot on her from the fire. Like, it's just happened, even though it's clearly now the next day, and, like, do the police not have any questions for her? Maybe some paperwork to sign at least? I mean, her husband is dead. Is there no paperwork to sign in this universe? Sounds like a pretty good universe, I guess, where no paperwork needs to be signed when people are dead. So she goes back to the mother's house because apparently that's where Z's gonna be, and she's gonna play house with a demon. There's this really unsettling hide and seek game where she looks for Z and finds him. I have still really never been able to understand if she can actually see him throughout the movie in his full form, or does she just sense his presence? Does she really know what he looks like? Every time we see him throughout the movie, she seems very alarmed and off-put when she sees him, but she is practically with him all day and feels his presence all day, so why is her reaction so severe and alarmed every time? I don't really know. It's kind of not really well explained. She basically plays house with him for what looks like days, and she hasn't showered, and the doctor comes to see her. He asks to come in, but when she sees Z behind him inside, she frantically asks him to leave, which is kind of weird. I don't know why she couldn't just talk to him on the porch. When the doctor is leaving, he tells her that this is all in her head. What? Earlier in the film, he seemed to be completely convinced that this demon was after her family and her, and he seemed to have understanding of what this demon was, despite, no background in demonology or anything of the sort to understand what's going on. But now he's telling us that this is all in her head. This is opening up different holes in the plot that wasn't originally there, and being as the movie is going to end soon, not really a good moment to introduce new plot holes. That night, we see her playing hide and seek with Z again, which is really freaking weird. And she walks into the den where we saw her son staring at the fan earlier, and she finds what appears to be her father, who's hanged himself. So I guess that's why she didn't want her son in the room. I really don't know, but it's never been mentioned until now that he was even dead or that he killed himself, and it's kind of just smooshed into this story and completely irrelevant. She wakes up the next morning, and I guess Z wants to marry her? Kind of gross. She pretends to marry Z and then plays a game with him to distract him so she can make a phone call, as if he's not a demon and wouldn't hear her making a phone call. I don't really know. She finds out that Z overheard her make the phone call because, duh, and she thinks he's going to head out to kill Josh since he's jealous and wants her all to himself, I suppose, even though he could have killed Josh from the beginning, and the fact that he'd killed Josh now doesn't really make any sense. She calls her sister frantically, who finds Josh on the train tracks with a train heading right towards him. Okay. That I find there could be so much less dramatic. There could be so much less dramatics here, and yet we need a train rushing towards him because reasons. Just at that moment, the doctor returns to the house with the police. No idea why. Did she break any laws other than being weird? Are they here to take her to a mental institution? It's not really explained. He yells at her for all of this being her fault and in her head once again, which isn't really a very good thing for a doctor to say, especially if he wants her to open the door. She gets this brilliant idea, apparently, while we switch to the train speeding towards her son, who has apparently no survival instincts and won't get out of the way of a rushing train. She has this idea to take her own life so that the demon will leave her and her family alone. I don't really see how that would work. Wouldn't the demon still be around? I don't really know where storylines seem to just think that they can kill someone and everything's going to be okay. I don't know. And it doesn't matter how fast that sister is or how fast even the son is at this point. That train would have been hitting him, but whatever. In all conclusions, Josh doesn't die, and we find out that apparently Beth didn't die, and it all concludes with the sister Jenna, Josh, and Beth at dinner, and Beth seems completely out of it. Did the attempt on her life leave her brain damaged, or is she severely medicated? None of it is answered at all, just at all. And pretty much then the movie just ends, and we never get an answer on what actually happened. Okay, back to me. Overall, not an awful movie. I really did enjoy watching it. I thought that the acting was pretty good, but the script and the environment was lacking. You can't tell from my clips, but the music was so loud throughout this movie. I mean, at some moments, I really couldn't even focus on what was going on because the music was so loud. There's nothing wrong with making music impactful. It's very useful in changing the tone or emotion of the entire scene, but the music was so overpowering in most of the scenes in this movie that I felt like I would probably have to watch this movie at like 50% volume with subtitles if I wanted to actually watch the movie. It was unnecessary and overwhelming to have so many different plot inserts of her family members dying, such as her mother dying in the beginning and her father apparently taking his own life years ago, that was never really mentioned until literally 10 minutes before the movie was over, and it was kind of very haphazardly thrown in the last second, and the movie could have completely done without it, and if the movie could have done without something, you didn't do it right. Also, just we never got any explanation of Z's origin, where he came from, what he really wanted. We don't really know if he even wanted Beth throughout this whole thing, if it was sexual, if it was emotional, if he wanted to take her back to hell with him. We don't know any of this, and we were kind of left hanging on if Z was even real, or Z went away in the end when she attempted to take her life, or if Z is still in the house haunting the family. We never actually get an answer. And I mean, a movie doesn't have to have an answer, but a movie does have to have a conclusion, which this movie really didn't. And I'm not really going to harp on probably the pretty low CGI budget of this movie, but every single time we see Z throughout this entire film, he looks different. We see him originally in the playhouse when he's following Josh. Then we see him in the bathtub. We then see him at the scene when he kills the father. And we then see him standing behind the psychiatrist in the end. We don't see him at any other points in this movie, but every single time we see him, I feel like he looks different. I feel like you're adding more work for yourself by making the monster look different every time, and it was kind of not good. Hey guys, so that's it. We're wrapping it up. Thank you for watching. If there's any movies that you'd like me to review, I get these movies off Shudder. So please check out Shudder yourself. Watch some movies yourself on there. It's an excellent service to get behind. Anyway, thank you guys, and please do leave a like and subscribe if you do like this. It will help me out so much. Thank you.